The Star Wars was released in 1977 and quickly changed the landscape of what it meant to be a blockbuster movie. For one of the first times, being a fan of the movie almost became a hobby in itself, and it managed to develop into one of the most loved movies ever created, with one of the most ardent and faithful fan communities. Along with its monumental success, Star Wars also changed the way movies were merchandised. You could get Star Wars branded products of virtually anything you wanted, and many fans dreamed of that day when they'd be able to experience the scenes of the movie for themselves. Released in that same year was the Atari VCS, later renamed the 2600. As it grew in popularity, defining the video game market for the first time and creating the first gamers, it seemed like a licensed Star Wars game would be a match made in heaven. However, it wasn't until 5 years later that we managed to get the first Star Wars officially licensed video game. Parker Brothers, known for board games such as Monopoly, chose to go with the film released 3 years earlier, which at the time was the latest Star Wars movie, and released the first ever officially branded Star Wars game, The Empire Strikes Back, on the Atari 2600. Knowing the small resources of the Atari 2600, they chose to recreate a single scene from the film. In it, you control Luke's snowspeeder in the symbolic defence of Hoth, shooting down wave after wave of Imperial walkers. The player can destroy an AT-AT by repeatedly blasting it, making it change in colour, or by hitting a small flashing spot that appears randomly. Each one had 48 hit points, or 30 points if played on in television. Despite the crude gameplay and graphics of the time, finally being able to experience the scene from the movies in digital form was something that fueled fans' imaginations for generations to come, and this first attempt was held in high regard by gamers of the time, and many continue to enjoy it even to this day. With the release of The Return of the Jedi, the technology was finally in place that video games could be released much closer to the film. Parker Brothers remained in control and released Death Star Battle for the 2600, the first game in which you can take the reins of the Millennium Falcon, and also technically playing as Lando Calrissian, with the aim of breaking through a giant energy shield and destroying the Death Star once and for good. Unfortunately, despite having the Star Wars license, this was and is a fairly forgettable game that would most likely have been lost to history if it didn't feature the Star Wars name. Interestingly, in this game, the Death Star seems to look like a giant disco ball in space. Go figure. 1983 also saw the first time players could finally take control of a lightsaber for themselves. Jedi Arena contested the player with defending against laser blast by a Seeker, but also trying to deplete the enemy's shield, somewhat influenced by Luke's first forays with the Force upon the Millennium Falcon. Whilst clearly very basic, and perhaps not the type of controls players dreamed of, allowing players to directly control a lightsaber would become one of the defining pursuits and demands of players in almost every Star Wars game released to date, a pursuit which almost every single Star Wars game has been judged by.
The most eagerly awaited arcade game of the year, the brand new Star Wars. Sound familiar? Let's check out the action.
In 1983, Star Wars would also make its much anticipated entry into the arcades. Star Wars Arcade also had the honour of being the first time a game used digitised speech directly from a film, meaning this is also one of the very few Star Wars spin-offs that actually had the original voice actors. Star Wars Arcade put players directly behind the controls of an X-Wing through 3 different levels inspired by A New Hope, battling TIE fighters, flying through the trenches and attempting to destroy the Death Star for good. There were 2 versions of the machines created, a stand-up and a sit-down version, however they both utilise the rotary flight-style controls. Beating the game gives you a glorious 80's rendition of the Death Star's explosion scene, before starting you right back at the beginning of the game on a harder level. The colour vector graphics used in the game have given it a timeless feel, and it is a regular feature in many retro gaming competitions to date, and along with its sequel based on The Empire Strikes Back in 1985, are among some of the best examples of the vector shooter genre, and gave hope to Star Wars fans that the quality of licensed Star Wars games would remain to be as high quality. The game was since ported to many home consoles at the time, and even 8 and 16-bit home computers, continuously being released up until 1988, proving that its quality and appeal was very much enduring. Atari also produced in 1984 a more traditional raster graphics arcade version of Return of the Jedi. sitting you in various vehicles from the film in an isometric style, similar to Sega's Zaxxon. However, whilst popular at the time, it has not had the same lasting appeal as the Vector games, despite also being ported to many of the computers at the time. However, what it did prove was that developers were still experimenting with genres. Every Star Wars game of the time was quite different to one another, as it had not yet been defined what a perfect or expected Star Wars video game was.
We are now about to decide.
In 1987, the first attempt was made at fully recreating A New Hope in video game form, in the form of Star Wars on the Famicom, the Japanese equivalent to the NES. However, this was developed by Namco and never made it out of Japan. The game is a traditional hard-as-nails side-scrolling platformer that takes some heavy liberties with the story. For starters, Luke has black hair, however this was explained to be because of colour limitations. The game also featured levels that would seem completely out of place in the Star Wars universe, being based on ancient Egypt and floating platforms. The main thrust of the story is that Luke is saving his friends that have supposedly been captured by Darth Vader. However, upon rescuing them, they often turn into other creatures, such as a giant scorpion. This is supposedly in reference to the illusion scene that takes place in the cave on Dagobah. However, many gamers just found it odd. Despite all the changes made to the story, and the rather difficult gameplay, it was the first effort of recreating a Star Wars film in its entirety, something that is no mean feat. The last Star Wars licensed game of the 90s was also the first one not based on any of the feature films. Instead, it was based on the Saturday morning TV show of the time, Star Wars Droids. Star Wars Droids: Escape from Aaron was released on computer systems by Mastertronic, including the Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64, and it has largely been forgotten to time. In this, 3PO and R2 have been imprisoned and must work to escape the planet. The base consists of 8 levels, where you figure out basic puzzles in order to crack computer terminals so you can go to the next level. Gamers were not taken to it, however, and it quickly faded into ambiguity. Despite this, it proved that video games could now be based off of virtually anything connected to Star Wars, and as the universe and lore expanded, so would the settings of the video games in the future. Overall, the 1980s took Star Wars from a simple game based off one scene of a movie and turned it into a seal of quality that would be expected for many years. The first simple steps into a larger universe increased gamers' expectations that in time, with better consoles and graphical capabilities, the dream of finally playing through the entire trilogy may finally come true. Subscribe in advance for the next episode, share, like and visit www.valetic.com for more.